So my paper is entitled Post-Pop Tolkien. From hippies to priests, from election badges to song cycles, Tolkien's works have had a very varied reception history. And in this paper, I'd like to sketch 4 categories for thinking about that reception history from the 1950s to the early 21st century, where we find ourselves now. I'm going to be talking about them in chronological order, if only because they, I think, are dominant in Tolkien's reception in that sequence. But that's not to suggest that they can't exist at the same time, or that they are not interrelated. You know, everyone just doesn't decide that they are now in a new phase of Tolkien reception, and we should, you know, we should all change the way we engage with the legendarium. So these categories are literary, cult, pop, and post-pop. And I'm going to be thinking about the ways in which they involve different modes of engagement with Tolkien, different ideas of what Tolkien's works are and are for, and how that leads us up to the present day and current engagements, appropriations, and receptions. Firstly then, what I've titled literary reception. This is a way of reading, discussing, and responding to Tolkien's works and legendarium, which regards them as novels, as works of literary artistry. And I've chosen a couple of examples here. One is the review by Richard Hughes in The Spectator in 1954, where he describes The Lord of the Rings as something that has scarcely been attempted on this scale since Spenser's Faerie Queene. And that struck me as an interesting example, because obviously it's in a literary paper. It's regarding the works as fictional exercises in creative writing, and it's placing them within the literary canon. Spenser seemed to be a particularly interesting comparison, since he's definitely a classic, and I think possibly even more so a classic for readers in the 1950s than us, where he's I think often regarded as sort of a side road of early modern writing. Pardon me. And he's also a medievalist himself. You know, he's writing fiction about a medievalist world that certainly doesn't exist in his era, even if it did, which is dubious, in previous eras. So there's an attempt here to slot Tolkien into literary history and to find an analogue for him within the canon that also includes Wordsworth and Milton and Chaucer and people like that. Another example of this might be Naomi Mitchison's famous review, where she says it's quite extraordinary. One takes The Lord of the Rings as seriously as one takes Mallory. And again, another attempt to look at this stuff and to find a literary analogue, a way of slotting it into literary history. This might seem a really obvious point, but actually I think a lot of our instinctive engagement with Tolkien in the late 20th century, early 21st century, probably, certainly in my case, thinks about him as a sort of myth maker, as an inventor of speculative worlds, rather than as a Don who wrote a novel. Reframing him as a writer of fiction who, for his contemporaries, was a modern novelist of the mid-20th century, I think can open up some interesting readings of him. One can think of him as someone who engages with early medieval literature, with Norse and Viking material, with Middle English romance, but also as someone, after all, who was writing at the same time as Graham Greene, who, when the Fellowship of the Ring was published, I think was working on The End of the Affair. Evelyn Waugh is working on the Sword of Honor trilogy. 5 years after the Fellowship of the Ring comes out, David Lodge's first novel comes out, The Picturegoers, which is also, and you'd have noticed that I'm talking about 3 for their Catholic male novelists, also a novel that wrestles with the intrusions and problems of sort of industrialized and mediatized society in the Catholic mid-century. So that's, you know, that's a way that his contemporaries saw him that I think sometimes we don't always do so. I've noted that the year that Fellowship of the Ring came out, Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis came out, Iris Murdoch's Under the Net, Nancy Mitford's Madame de Pompadour. So this first mode of engagement sees him as primarily a literary figure. And some of the most interesting scholarship, I think, over the last sort of 10 or so years has engaged with him in this way. I'm thinking particularly of Dimitra Feeney's Fairies to Hobbits, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, Holly Ordway's Tolkien's Modern Reading, which I will put up my hands to. I haven't read yet. It's only just come out. But the way it's talked about online makes it sound fascinating. The second example of this literary kind of reception that I've chosen is the song cycle by Donald Swann, The Road Goes Ever On. So Swan's more famous for his collaborations with Michael Flanders as part of the songwriting duo Flanders and Swan, when he famously wrote the Ostrich Song, the Hippopotamus Song, Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud, but also wrote things like an opera based on Colin Wilson's The Outsider, an opera based on C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. There's a future product for members of the Tolkien Society staging something like that, staging that The Road Goes Ever On or something. And he also wrote songs about the cuts to the railways by Dr. Beeching, the habit of trippers of leaving litter in country ponds, 1950s interior decor in Design for Living. So all of this, I think, gives us a sense of this period of Tolkien's reception. He's seen as a novelist. His work is serious but accessible, like Donald Swan's music. It's within a classically influenced medium, and it's sort of third program rather than either very, very highbrow or sort of pop. The next category then is cult Tolkien. And I've defined this as reception which associates Tolkien with culture consciously at variance with the dominant or established culture and mores of the time. Hence the Gandalf for President badge, which as a single image provocatively interpolates Gandalf into the late 1970s American political system. It imagines how ridiculous it would be for the kind of leadership and the kind of moral authority that Gandalf wields for readers of the books to be placed alongside the machinations of the Chicago machine of the Democratic Party or the disagreements amongst the GOP. It interposes Tolkien against dominant and established culture and says, here's something else. Here's another way of thinking about the world. The reason I've put the other picture of Gandalf there with Frodo next to him is that I'm intrigued by the accent that Frodo has in the Ralph Bakshi 1978 animated version of The Lord of the Rings. It's a bit niche, this one, but I'm just fascinated. He speaks in this sort of half Cockney, half drawl London accent that actually I think picks up this idea of slightly countercultural Tolkien. He talks like someone in Carnaby Street, like David Bailey or one of the Rolling Stones. Oh, Keith. He has this slight air of when London was associated with counterculture, with slightly working class people made good, and that was sort of Britain's cultural reputation for rock and roll and stuff. So after that monstrous over-reading of a casual accent, my second example of cult Tolkien comes from the archives of the Tolkien Society itself. These are pages from Belladonna's broadsheet, an ancestor of Amon Hen, which is very kindly digitized and made available for scholars and readers in the Society's archives. And this very first issue contains a vignette in which the editor imagines Gandalf coming to see the editor in this little sort of nook or apartment they have, and they share a pipe and a glass of ale. And the editor says to Gandalf, "What do you think about Gandalf's garden? What do you think of this garden they've planted for you in London?" And Gandalf goes huff and fulminates and says, "There's something wrong with this garden. They've let wrong influences in." And this refers to an actual place in London, Gandalf's Garden, a sort of shop / commune / hangout. It's a sort of countercultural centre. I've put at the bottom there a quotation from its own publication, Gandalf's Garden. "Gandalf's Garden is the magical garden of our inner worlds, overgrowing into the world of manifestation. Gandalf's Garden is soul flow from the pens of creators, mystics, writers, artists, diggers, delvers, and poets, a wellspring of love and anguish that those with searching thirsts may drink thereof." I'm not sure that thereof is grammatical, but it's deeply heartfelt, clearly, at the end of that sentence. And you can see here a new mode of Tolkien engagement, not unlike the Gandalf for President badge, I think. This sense that Tolkien offers a different vision of the world, not simply a piece of well-written creative writing or a literary work that might be related to previous artistic efforts and graded or evaluated. It's worth pointing out that people who reviewed Tolkien's work in the 50s and onwards often didn't like it. Early reviews call it donnish, boring, infantile, pretentious, but they slate it as a book. They slate it as an artistic artifact, a novel. Here we see a move away into thinking about Tolkien's work's value as opening up alternative worlds onto which countercultural or utopian or sort of dreaming values and hopes can be projected, not primarily as books, but as symbols of other alternative worlds. Not everyone is happy with this. As I've pointed out, the issue of Belladonna's broadsheet, Gandalf is imagined taking these people to task and saying, oh, we were for liberation and liberality, but not for this sort of psychedelic hodgepodge of Buddhism and Jainism and occultism and psychedelia. And he mentions the other wizard that they're talking about, the man who says that do what thou wilt was never part of any wizard's law, which is of course a quotation from Aleister Crowley. So he pits the two wizards against each other, so that Tolkien's sort of fandom in this sense, although obviously this is a bit earlier than we can talk about fandom in the modern sense, but Tolkien's fandom is going down a wrong path. What strikes me as well is that Belladonna's broadsheet, in inventing this conversation between the editor and Gandalf, is doing the same sort of, or the same mode of reception and appropriation as the hippies at Gandalf's garden, because it's imagining Gandalf as a person whom you can sort of play act as. And actually, one of the correspondents of the magazine objected to this and wrote a letter that appears in the next issue saying, less of this playing at being Tolkien. We should be doing literary readings of these texts. But even though Belladonna's broadsheet is worried about this hippie, cultish, in possibly more than one sense, direction that Tolkien reception is going in, it still engages in this kind of get inside Tolkien's world and pretend you can talk to the characters and they can talk back to you. So that's what I've called the cult engagement. The next is pop engagement. And I've chosen a couple of examples here from the films which Will mentioned at the beginning of our session that came to define what I've called pop Tolkien, and certainly brought Tolkien to a much wider audience. I've chosen a couple of examples that are somewhat lighthearted because they provoked very strong reactions, both pro and con, from watchers of the films. So this crucial moment at which Aragorn opens the doors of Helm's Deep, this has provoked a lot of responses. I don't know whether you've come across them. People online have feelings about this moment. They have strong and intricately expressed feelings, and some of the more polite feelings they have include this tweet that I've cited here, describing this as the exact moment a Legolas girl becomes an Aragorn woman. However heartfelt or whatever the emotional truth there is, this strikes me as fascinating because we see Tolkien being interpreted within a very specific framework, the framework of blockbuster action movies and the framework of coming of age fictions for young women. Tolkien read as YA, Tolkien read as what would eventually become things like the Hunger Games and whatnot. This light-hearted tweet suggests that for a generation, Tolkien is readable in this moment as the same kind of coming of age tale in which one interpolates oneself and one realizes one's emotional development. That's much more familiar from other forms of fiction, specifically the growing popularity of young adult fiction. Legolas shield boarding, this ticked off the fans as well. Some people thought it was rad. Some people thought it was definitely not rad. This is a much more obvious moment, I think, and a moment in which there was a lot of resistance because it seemed so obviously to be taking Tolkien's Middle-earth material and interpolating it into a different frame of reference, a frame of reference that many watchers weren't comfortable with because it placed Tolkien alongside things like the X Games. Very popular in the culture at the time. By useful, scholarly, useful coincidence, the first year that the X Games held their World Championship series was the year that this film came out. So it's bringing Tolkien into a much more mass media arena and interpreting moments within other forms of entertainment framework. And this is what got some fans very angry, that they said this is a step too far. It's interesting to debate whether actually Aragorn becoming a YA hero or Legolas becoming an X Games contestant is the more significant movement in pop Tolkien. But I think in both these moments we can see the discourses of dominant Anglo-American popular culture being used to process, produce, appropriate, and disseminate Tolkien material, what I'm calling their pop Tolkien. And so after pop Tolkien comes post-pop Tolkien. I've got a couple of examples here, and I first noticed this mode during a conversation with a friend. Inevitably, having proposed these categories, post-pop Tolkien is, I think, a bit more nebulous than the others, if only because it's easier to look back at historical literary history or cultural history and say, oh yes, that was the sphere when that happened, that was the time that that happened. And if we're currently in the post-pop Tolkien age, as I'm suggesting, then it's perhaps inevitable that we don't find it as easy to say, oh yes, this is definitely what's going on. But there were a couple of kinds of engagement with Tolkien, which, in a couple of spheres, that strike me as distinct from what we've seen before, and share a kind of ethos, share a kind of approach to Tolkien, which I'm calling post-pop. And they appear in two spheres, Catholic Christianity and modern medieval studies. So as I say, I first noticed this tone, this ethos, this approach in a conversation with a friend who's a priest in rural ministry. And she said to me jokingly that she had to be a bit careful in her rural parish wandering around the woods which of her clerical vestments she wore. Not because her parishioners disapproved of either dressing too simply or too finely, but she left her clerical cloak with the brooch that fastens at the throat behind in the vicarage. She didn't wear that when wandering around the woods and fields, because she was all too aware of her own tendency, her own risk to slip into imagining herself as a Tolkien character wandering around in a swishy cloak. And she told this story to me as a funny anecdote, but with no sense that it was a betrayal of her vocation, or that even that it trivialized her place as a priest in the community. She told it as a sort of funny story about two things in her life that were really intertwined: her faith in her ministry and her Tolkien fandom, and that actually you could accidentally spend a bit more focus on one at a moment when you should have focus on the other. It wasn't that they were inimical or hostile to each other; they were just intertwined things, and because they were so intertwined, you could accidentally, trip from one into the other and be going to take a service and actually be imagining yourself as an elf princess somewhere. And of course, there seems to be a common origin there. It seemed to me that her Tolkien fandom and her experience of ministry, their trappings drew on a common source. It's not a coincidence that the cloak worn by an Anglican priest in their parish looks like the cloaks worn by hobbits and elves. It's because they both took their fixed form in medieval England for very different reasons. And a similar impression was made on me by another acquaintance mentioning casually that they used the word Yarendil in their prayers as a title, their private prayers, their private devotions, as a title for Christ. And there on the screen is the opening lines of one of the O antiphons, which uses that word, Yara Arendil, Engla, etc., etc., etc. And I discovered, doing a bit of reading online, that other people use Elbereth as a title of reverence for the Virgin Mary. And again, this struck me as interesting, another intertwining of religious experience and devotion with Tolkien fandom and Tolkien's works. Since it seems undeniable that most people who come across the word Yarendil are coming across it from Tolkien. Very few people are reading the poetry of the Anglo-Saxon poets in the original. Most of us can only sort of hobble through it with a crib and a dictionary in hand. And yet some people seem to be able to use it as it was originally a title for Christ, or an address to Christ, in a devotional context, whilst also being aware of its Tolkien usage, and that those two things did get in the way. They could both use it as an image that illuminated early medieval devotion, and indeed their own spiritual life, whilst being aware that it was for them filtered through Tolkien. Tea with Tolkien in the corner there, a modern Catholic blog with a very contemporary aesthetic, seems to also, I think, balance or keep in dialogue these two forms of experience. The other kind of post-pop I've mentioned here is the modern medieval strand. So again, as was mentioned at the beginning of our session by Will, there's been an explosion of publications over the last 20 years or so, and the history of Middle-earth having been more or less complete by the end of the 20th century, the things that have been published tend to be and I use this with great respect, more minor works. I find them actually in many ways more interesting, but they are perhaps more minor to the grand scale of Tolkien's works. So things like The Fall of Arthur in 2015, Monsters and the Critics, reprinted in 2006, Beowulf and the Selic Spell, 2014. The same year saw a republication of his translation of the Pearl Poets' works, The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun in 2010. And this medieval focused material has, I think, produced a shift in his public profile and also in which the ways in which people engage with it. So the excellent blog A Clerk of Oxford by Eleanor Parker talks about Tolkien's fiction and Tolkien's medievalism in the context of history and poetry and religious devotion in ways that see them as largely coherent, don't see them as sometimes they were discussed in the past as the intriguingly flip sides of an enigmatic personality. How could he possibly both be this great fantasy novelist and this sort of dry and dusty philologist? And my own anecdotal experience of university departments suggests that in circles where medieval literature is either studied from a scholarly point of view or read for fun, people seem more comfortable with the idea that students not only came to medieval work via Tolkien, but that they are parallel and overlapping interests. That it's not something that you introduced you to the work and then you got to the real medieval stuff and you forgot all this silly Tolkien nonsense. They seem to be, like those religious experiences, religious devotions, able to engage with both Tolkien and the things standing behind Tolkien, if you like. And both examples struck me as Tolkien operating in a very long literary and religious tradition, and people being able to engage with him and the tradition he opened up without substituting one for the other. So Tolkien becomes a different kind of engagement with culture in the world than the pop Tolkien, the cult Tolkien, the anti-establishment Tolkien, or the literary Tolkien. So as I said, those can coexist. This is simply the most recent development that I've noticed in the reception, interpretation, and appropriation of his works. It's a bit more nebulous. It's, as you can hear, not totally theorized yet. I think if I had more time and space, we might theorize it in terms of a dialectic between fictional and real worlds that, again, some of the papers have touched on already. Farah Mendelssohn's work opened this up, Rhetorics of Fantasy, in terms of literary study, and I think it would repay thinking about Tolkien in that way. And these forms of engagement are chronological, as I said, but they can exist at the same time. They certainly can exist because we notice them, I think, most sharply when people disagree, when different claims or visions or tones, modes of Tolkien are argued as more authentic, more valuable, more inclusive, more true to the spirit, etc. And as soon as that happens, people start arguing, and so we see their positions more clearly. So it's perhaps at the moments of controversy when these modes are most visible to us. And as I say, they happen at the same time. So Belladonna's broadsheet has Gandalf complaining about hippie wizards at the same time when a letter to the broadsheets complain that they shouldn't put words in the wizard's mouth. Fans object to Legolas looking like a contestant at the X Games at the same time that Aragorn is being made part of the emotional journey of YA readers. Amazon advertises for actors happy to do nude scenes in their Lord of the Rings series at the same time that people are using words from Tolkien's Legendarium in their private devotions. And at the same time, an online seminar is being held on 21st century receptions of Tolkien. So with that, I will thank you for your time and answer any questions.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry. Thank you very much, Jem. A really different way of considering how Tolkien has actually entered our world and how we've developed and changed him into our own ways. But I like the reference as well to what you're saying about these minor works. Actually, they're more interesting at times because when they seem to give this a much grander, holistic picture of where he was coming from and what he was trying to do as well. So thank you very much. Right. Okay, let's get to a couple of questions. Okay, so first question. Hi, Jem. Great presentation. I'm curious, which is your personal preference of Tolkien engagement? So literary, cult, pop, post-pop, and why?
Excellent question. Thank you. I probably tend towards literary or post-pop. by profession, I'm obviously a literary sort of critic and historian. So I'm, as I said, I think some of the most interesting scholarship happening, not to scan other scholars, some of the most interesting scholarship is happening, reframing Tolkien as an author of his own period. Engaging with his own culture in his own time, in a way that goes beyond, there was a big war, people were worried about nuclear bombs. That's, there's valuable readings. So I think I probably tend towards that. But I am intrigued by this post-pop engagement, because I think it enables an engagement with Tolkien's work, and as I say, the things that stand behind it, that doesn't require us to choose one or the other, doesn't require us to use Tolkien as a means into it or as a way out of it, so to speak. Yeah, possibly I'm favouring it because it just seems fascinating. It's something I'm trying to grasp and trying to work on academically. But I really like the way in which, I say, from Tolkien can be discussed in religious communities without it becoming just a metaphor. Isn't Jesus a little bit like X? Like a spoon or a yogurt or a skateboard or Gandalf? That genuinely there is something more there than metaphor. There is actually analogy in the medieval sense, that it can enrich discussions via that. And I think the same is true in medieval work, rather than it being an arc that gets you to the good stuff. There's a continual dialectic where it enriches your reading of Tolkien and it enriches your understanding of the medieval material.
Yeah, super, thank you. And another question, do you think the majority of the pop Tolkien connections and trends are rooted to specific times, i.e. primarily in the 60s/70s, when Tolkien became very big in American culture, and in the early 2000s when the movies came out?
I think so. I mean, the short answer is yes. I reckon you're right. I think those modes are, and whoever asked that question, you're quite right to point out, these are historically contingent things. They develop in dialogue with the culture of the time, and those moments when Tolkien attains a new kind of audience or attains a new sphere, I think we do see a new mode develop. So, I mean, the obvious comparison is someone like C.S. Lewis. At college, I ran into people who were American students who had a very specific notion of C.S. Lewis. Lewis was this very evangelical, sort of aggressively proselytizing guy who said some very specific things about grief and the atonement, and had also written some children's books. This was not my experience as a British person in the sort of 90s and 2000s, who saw Lewis as a fantasy novelist who at some point had done some preaching. And there's been some interesting scholarly work on that actually as well, the way the different Lewises developed. And I think we do have different Tolkiens, particularly in an era, picking up your point about the 60s and 70s, when the cultural spheres are much more separate. You couldn't buy a lot of American fantasy books in Britain in the 60s and 70s. There were specific publishers that were shipping them over. It was expensive. The net book agreement stopped you or held you back from doing that. There wasn't the kind of fluidity there would be today. So I think you're absolutely right there. Yeah, these modes are very much affected by the form of mediation that's going on and the period that happened in.
Excellent, very well put, thank you. Now, with that, we have actually come to the end of the first part of today's seminar. So, Jem, once again, thank you very much for presenting to us and making us think a little bit more about that post-pop Tolkien within our own lives. Thank you.